We now turn to Aristotle's On the Soul, where we pick up and follow some of the threads that were discussed in Aristotle's Physics and the Metaphysics. So in the Physics, Aristotle inquired generally into nature, so what is it that exists and has motion, in more abstract causality itself. In the Metaphysics, we also inquired into nature, but we inquired into intelligible nature, the essence of things. When we come to know them, what are they in the nature that is being grasped, in their nature that is being grasped by the mind? Now, in On the Soul, or in the Latin translation de anima, right, of animation, or the Greek word psyche for soul, Aristotle is inquiring into life itself. So those beings which have the ability to move themselves, right? Because rocks, dirt, simple dirt, does not have the ability to move itself, to grow and decay. So what is it then that allows living things to do this? Why is it that, for example, human beings possess an intellect where we can say human beings can become wise, as where maybe dogs can't become wise, or insects don't know things? So we can begin with the soul in general, in the same way in Plato's Euthyphro we began general with the question of what is piety and tried to then narrow down into the essence of the thing. We can ask in general then of all the things that are said to possess a soul, plants, non-human animals, humans, is the soul something material, right? Is it like rock? Is it like the skin? Is it tangible? Is the soul immaterial? Would it be something like in the Abrahamic traditions where the soul lives on in the afterlife, right? Even when the body dies, such that the body really is like a vehicle of which the soul is kind of like the driver of the vehicle, and then the soul is like, I don't want this vehicle anymore, and it goes on. For Aristotle to understand whether the soul is material or immaterial, we have to understand the distinction between matter and form. So matter is the materiality of something tangible. So it's not necessarily something intelligible. It is that which is not an underlying thing, and it is that which can be molded. Form is the potentiality and or actuality of a thing. So, for example, and some of this is what we saw in the Physics, we could have planks of wood, which would be matter, which contain a certain potential to possess bedness, which would be a form constructed by arranging the matter in such a way that now we can recognize this thing as being a bed. Such that then the wood comes to contain bedness, or chairness, if we fashioned a chair out of wood. So in the same way, we can think of, again, a cat, where like the fur is the matter of the cat, but the form of the cat is the catness, right? The thing which is what cats do. It's not simply how the cat looks, but it's all the things that a cat does to successfully exist as a cat. So we could ask, is it possible to have one without the other? Can you have matter without form, or form without matter? For Aristotle, there's only one thing which can exist without the other, and that is form. And the reason we'll see later is because the mind can perceive things, right? It can come to represent, I can think of a chair without there being a chair that actually exists in the world. So this is important in starting to build up a theory of the soul for Aristotle. Now we asked, is the soul material or is it immaterial? For Aristotle, it's a composition of material and form. He says, now the material is a potency, but the form is a being at work, staying itself. And this in two senses, one in the manner of knowledge, the other in the manner of the act of contemplating. So the soul is a material in terms of its potency, because we could have a seed, which of course is a material, that has the potential to become a tree, But the form would be the tree becoming, growing into a tree and staying a tree, right? Successfully treeing. So it's important then to understand the soul is not a body, because the body, like some people had argued in ancient Greece, for Aristotle, he argues the body is not an underlying thing. So the body itself, right, just like rocks, don't animate themselves. There's something underlying the material of rocks, underlying flesh, underlying wood and fiber, right, that makes trees, which gives life to that material, which is the fiber or the flesh or the bones. Such that, as again, as he says here, but rather the body has being as an underlying thing, having thinghood, which we can understand as essence, and material. Right? So it has a certain look to it. It becomes intelligible. We can discern it from a myriad background of other materiality, we could say. I don't want to say materials, because then that would say that already we can distinguish different kinds of materials having being as well. So let's think about this. Even if, right, we wanted to take a, I don't know, some kind of like a new atheist viewpoint and argue everything in the world is material, right? There's nothing immaterial. We would need to ask, why aren't human beings like rocks? Or more generally, why aren't animals like rocks? Or why aren't rocks human beings? What is that potency which allows certain materials to then grow and decay and others to not do that? Now, some people have tried to put Aristotle in one of two camps, that really for him, the soul is, it definitely is, like he could be assimilated to a scientific worldview, a materialist scientific worldview, where, again, the soul, right, there's just the body and that's it, because for Aristotle, he argues the soul does not live on after the body dies. The soul dies with the body. Other people try to argue, well, because, as we'll see later, what he says about the intellect, where it is not bound by the body, it's the only part of the soul that is not necessarily rooted in the body, that means the soul is immaterial. It is like that, when we think of like a spirit, right, in a religious sense, it's something like that. But those would both be wrong ways to go about Aristotle here, because we have to remember the dialectical process that's going on with Aristotle, where he's looking at these wide-ranging arguments about the soul in this Greek context of the philosophers in his time, and he's saying, yes, some of these hit upon something right about the form of the soul, and others, right, go too far in other areas. Which is why, again, as he always says, right, the soul is said in many ways, right? There are always many ways we can think about the soul. And we cannot think about the soul lacking a body, and we cannot think about the soul lacking that motion, right, which is an underlying thing, which is not simply a body, which brings something to life. So what is common to all souls? Aristotle says, it is a being at work staying itself. So this would be the Intellect for the Greek word. It is that ability for it to persist by itself through time. So it is a being at work staying itself of the first kind of a natural, organized body. That is what all souls have in common, that they go on remaining, right, themselves doing what it is they exist for, the end for which they exist. So what does it mean for something to be alive then, right? So we can come to an understanding of life itself for Aristotle. He says, so just as the act of cutting is for the axe and the act of seeing for the eye, so too is the waking condition a being at work staying itself. But as the power of sight is to the eye and the capacity of the tool to the axe, so is the soul a being at work staying itself, while the body is what has being and potency. Because again, the body has a potential to be many different things, and it is the soul that realizes this. It actualizes then the potential for the body. So the soul is not simply like we would liken to then an axe, right, that just cuts things, but it's the potentiality for the axe to become that thing which cuts, or it is the potentiality for the eye to see. A dead body, even though it might have eyes, does not see. It needs the soul for it to be actualized. So we can think of all living things as necessarily having one of these. Either an intellect, possessing perception, right? All animals possess perception. Aristotle says they must possess at least touch and taste, right? And the more complex ones can have sight and hearing and so on, of course, right? And the ability to smell. Only humans have intellect. But all animals also have the ability to move and stop with respect to place, right? That's how they survive in the environment, go after prey, and so on. And then the motion that results from nourishment. So this is the most basic kind of which plants have, right? They're able to grow, but they cannot move and chase after prey, right? And hunt and things like that. And all bodies then must also have the ability to decay. For Aristotle, if something did not decay, it would not be a body. So for Aristotle, that means it's impossible for you to be immortal and still have a soul. You would not possess all the characteristics which are common to souls in general. So there's a way in which we can break down the soul according to three basic types. Now, the most basic is the nutritive type of soul. And there are two kinds. There's the non-moving and the moving. Because, of course, human beings possess the nutritive part of the soul because we grow, right? And we're nourished by having food and water and so on. But plants, right? These do not move around like animals do. So that's the most basic kind. It lacks any kind of capacities which we might liken to, psychological capacities. The next kind, which does contain the nutritive part of the soul, but now then possesses the perceptive part of the soul. So those that possess perceptive part of the soul are animals in general. And they all possess the capacity for pain and pleasure, which Aristotle says allows them to achieve the end of flourishing as the end of the perceptive soul itself, right? So they can taste something and it doesn't taste right, so they don't eat it. They can see things, right? They might get attacked, and of course this is going to be painful, which is going to cause them to defend themselves, right? Or try to run away or things like that. And what accompanies that then is desire. So all souls which are perceptive possess desire because they must go after that which will nourish themselves. But we can break it down even further because there are some perceptive that actually possess imagination. So for Aristotle, like monkeys, for example, would possess imaginative capabilities. Other ones, like insects, do not possess imaginative capabilities. And we'll see the relation between imagination and perception and thinking in general, actually, in a little bit. Finally, the most advanced type of soul is the soul, of course, possessed by human beings. This is a traditional argument in philosophy, and that is the intellectual soul. Now, the intellectual soul is actually separable from the body. It's the only part of the soul which is not bodily. But, again, this does not mean the soul is therefore immaterial. It is inseparable from the body in that it is able to imagine and perceive things. It is able to think abstract truths. Specifically, Aristotle always references mathematical calculations. But the thing is, the intellectual soul never appears without a body. So even though it is separable from the body, because one, he says, could imagine that the soul, the intellectual part, could go on even after the body dies, still grasping the truth of things, that it never does so. Because it only exists because of the perceptive soul and the nutritive soul. He says, so since the soul is that by which, in the primary sense, we live and perceive and think things through, it would be a certain sort of articulation and form, and not an underlying material. That the soul then we can understand as a certain articulation, as a certain look to it that is distinguishable from simply material that can be molded into other things. And it's important to understand that this part of the soul cannot just be likened to the mind, right? We'll see later on with like Descartes. In early modern philosophy, they talk about the mind and they do not talk about the soul in this way that has the power to reason. For Aristotle, the soul has the power to reason. The translator of this text, Joe Sachs, he gives a very good reason why Aristotle only uses the Greek word for mind once in this text on the soul. And for Sachs, it's because mind is too ambiguous and too narrow. Because for Aristotle, the soul is not simply the mind, because the soul is embodied, right? As you'll see for someone like René Descartes, the mind is something immaterial. It can be divorced from the body because it is an indivisible thing, whereas all bodies are divisible. But for Aristotle, the soul is bound up with the body such that the end of the body cannot be divorced from the being of the mind, like modernist philosophers like Descartes would argue. So this is very important to understand that the mind contains an end that is made possible only by the perceptive part of the soul, and therefore which is only made possible by the nutritive part of the soul. Now, one simple definition of the soul, then, that we could just move on with now, is the soul is the being at work staying itself of some body. Right? It is some body that is taken on some form and it stays that form. That is the soul. That's the process of the soul. And we can visualize in this hierarchy of the development of the soul, right, where on the bottom, the most basic is the plants, which contains nutrition, growth, reproduction. Then more advanced animals, which do contain, right, that nutritive part of the soul. But they also have sensation and pleasure, perception. And then, of course, the most advanced, which again contains the lower two, is humans, which possess intellect, the capacity to reason. Now, some souls, therefore, right, have different capacities than others. Why? Well, we can remember what we had learned from the physics. We always want to begin our inquiry for Aristotle looking for what he calls that for the sake of which, the end of something, right? The telos of a thing. So the telos of the nutritive soul is nourishment. The telos of the perceptive soul is pleasure, right? So an animal lives well based on pleasure, right? And if it's constantly in pain, it has not been living well. So what is the end of the intellectual soul? Aristotle actually does not say in this text. We only get the end of the soul possessed by humans in his ethics, specifically the Nicomachean ethics, because the end of the soul pertains to a flourishing, a well-being, a life well lived, right? Which is translated as eudaimonia, which is, it's not really happiness, like a psychological, like if I eat a very good meal, I'm happy with the meal, or I watch a movie, and it makes me happy. But it's a happy of a kind of flourishing of an entire life. And that involves contemplation, things that animals which lack the intellectual soul cannot do, which is why philosophy is necessary for living the good life, for achieving the desired end of the intellectual soul. And what we can see in this text in particular is that we are investigating the mind, and by investigating the mind, we are investigating what makes humans human. Another way we can look at Aristotle's division of the soul is one where we divide it into the non-rational element, which would contain the nutritive part of the soul, right, which is possessed by plants, and the desiring or perceptive part of the soul, which is possessed by animals, which they also then would possess the nutritive part. And then we can look at the other side, the rational elements of the soul, which are possessed by human beings, containing theoretical reason and practical reason. Theoretical reason is that part of the intellect which seeks foundational principles. So this is what is done in metaphysics, because you seek the essence of all things, that which underpins it and makes it possible. This, for Aristotle, makes possible practical reason. And practical reason, right, always is a means to another end. So you seek truth and practical reason. You deliberate practically if you want to put it to use. As where theoretical reason, you seek that knowledge for its own sake. So if I use practical reason, I might be a sculptor, and I want to be a good sculptor, so I learn the art of sculpting so that I can be a good sculptor. But if I'm a philosopher, I might want to know what the soul is for the sake of knowing the soul, because it is true. But we can see with this depiction of the soul how practical reason also can influence desire. And practical reason then, therefore influencing desire, can actually influence the nutrition of ourselves as well. Because we could think about, well, I want to be a really good athlete, so I might have to change my diet, and that is going to affect, right, how I grow in the shape. You know, maybe I need to become stronger or put on some weight, right? So it's not like these are isolated, but they play upon one another. So we can try to distinguish a bit the capabilities of the souls, though I know this is going to begin getting a bit tedious. But it's impossible, we should understand, to for separate senses, right? So like the eyes, the tongue, hands, to distinguish what is in fact distinguished when something becomes intelligible. And we learned some of this from Plato's Theaetetus, right? It is the eyes which perceive maybe the blackness of a table, but it would be the hands knocking on it which perceive the kind of sound, the blackness which is on the wood, which makes the table, which the sound might make, right? And then that all is incorporated into how we perceive the being of the table. So perceiving and understanding are not the same, right? To understand something is a process where all those different attributes are put together by some one thing. So the senses do not put together these attributes. Instead, right, the mind does. And this is why for animals, they are able to think. Some are. Insects cannot think. But like dogs or monkeys or cats, for Aristotle, they can think, which is why they can imagine, but they cannot reason. So they are able to piece things together as well, which is in some way, right, maybe why a dog can distinguish different human beings. So the understanding, right, the intellectual part of the soul concerns the true, whereas thinking doesn't, right? Animals can have opinions about things. They can judge a certain thing as to whether they like it or they don't like it. They, right, want to pursue it, so they desire it or not. None of that matters whether or not it is true. Only the intellect can discern the true from the false. Now, imagination is a kind of thinking, which is why, again, animals possess it, and human beings do as well. But it's also not simply perception, right? So it's different from simple thinking, where I could deliberate about whether or not I wanted to have Popeyes for dinner or cook pasta, right? So Aristotle gives us some examples, and one is that one would be moved to fear, for example, in the same way that one might be maybe slightly fearful when they're seeing a painting which depicts something fearful, right? But that's going to be very different from perceiving something that is frightening in itself right in front of me. So for Aristotle, imagination then is a derivative form of sense perception, because it's emotion coming about as a result of the being at work of sense perception and corresponding to it. So this is what's interesting, right? Imagination is not perception, but perception makes possible imagination, because if one had no senses, they could not imagine. Why? Because for Aristotle, anytime the mind thinks, it always does so in the form of representation. It always perceives something. So there is no thinking without perceiving something. But that doesn't mean I need to be perceiving something through my senses, right? So there's a mental perception, and then there's a physical perception. So what about the intellect then, right? What is Aristotle's philosophy of mind here for human beings, and what it is that makes reason reason? For Aristotle, the intellect's nature is a potency. It's not any one of the things that are, though, until it thinks. So the mind actually takes on the form, for Aristotle, that which it thinks. That is why the mind is able to know things that are necessarily true. So he understands intellect to be that by which the soul thinks things through and conceives that something is the case, because it has the potential to represent all those things, and in representing those things, it takes on the form of those things. So the thinking soul for Aristotle is a place of forms only in potency, and this is different from Plato. For Plato, right, the rational soul taking on true knowledge of the true, that would be taking on the actuality of the realm of the forms that we talked about when discussing the metaphysics. But for Aristotle, it's only a place of potential forms. It is not some separate realm of the forms, right, that exists, which is different from the body or the material world. So it's a place of forms only in potency, but not in its being at work staying itself. Because it becomes a form, not simply the place where forms exist, once it is a being at work staying itself, once it has taken on that thing, and it is realizing, say, the truth of something. So all material things then are potentially something intelligible. We can, anytime, like let's say, if I did not know how to distinguish between brick and stone, there's still the potential for me to distinguish between brick and stone, even though maybe I haven't learned how to do that yet. So they are just material with the potentiality to become intelligible. Once I see the materials and I say, this material is brick, this material is stone, then I have actualized the intelligibility of the stone and the brick, which is possessed in the thing itself. Now, Aristotle does not give us a simple definition of knowledge like what was pursued in the Theaetetus, but he does give us some accounts of the way knowledge occurs and where it goes wrong in the soul. So practical thinking involves perception, right? Because practical thinking is always for some end in the material world, right? Like, I want to become a lawyer, right? So I need to learn how to, law. Or again, I was talking about being a sculptor and so on. While contemplative thinking involves only intelligibility. So knowledge, though, always involves perception, even if not perception of the senses, right? Because there could be a mental perception of something. So in the same way I might think of 2 plus 2, I might think of objects or drawn out numbers, 2 plus 2, things like that. When I think about 2, or if I think about a triangle, right? I'm perceiving a triangle in my mind, of course, even though I don't have to be perceiving an actual triangle in the material world. We go wrong, right? Falsehood occurs in the act of the intellect, so the soul, the rational part of the soul, putting things together, of compounding intelligible things, right? So it wrongly forms, in a way, the form of the intelligible things we are perceiving. Imagination, therefore, allows practical thinking to go beyond present perceptions, because, of course, I can think about a unicorn, even though unicorns don't exist, but I can think about a unicorn because I can maybe have seen a horse and, maybe like a Viking with a horn on their helmet or something like that, right? So imagination then allows us to consider distant possibilities and novel combinations of things in the future. And we'll see actually David Hume later on work off of that and talk about the way in which the mind then forms complex ideas based on our perceptions in the actual world. And finally, the soul is, Aristotle says, in a way, all beings. Now, this does not mean that the soul is literally all beings in some kind of like pantheistic or monist way where the soul is literally everything. But instead, the soul is in potentiality, which is why he says, in a way, it is all beings. Because the soul, coming to know things, takes on the form of those things that it knows. Now, all beings are perceptible or intelligible, right? Anything that exists, that has being, that has an essence, so not simply existence like it comes about in the world, right? It just happens to be there. But all things which have a being, an essence, a thinghood, are either perceptible, right? We can see them through the senses, or they're intelligible. They can be thought, and their essence can be known. He says, the soul is like a hand, for the hand is a tool of tools, while the intellect is a form of forms, and sense perception is a form of perceptible things. So, what he means by the soul is like a hand, and for the hand is a tool of tools, he means that the hand fashions itself in different ways based on the tools it uses. So if I pick up an axe, I might hold it one way, whereas if I hold a pencil, right, my fingers are going to twist in a slightly different way so that I can utilize the tool to its end. The soul for Aristotle, this is the same way for him when we come to know things. It takes on the form that is required to grasp it, either through sense perception or through the intellect. So intelligible things are present then in perceptible forms, which is why I am able to perceive a cat and discern that that is a cat out of all the other things, right, in my experiential background. And I can bring it to the foreground and say, this is something different. And this is a thing that is like other things that are, namely, cats. That's a really profound way to understand the soul, right? That it literally takes on, the intellectual part of it, that is. It takes on the form of those which it comprehends. And it's a profound way to think it, as he says, that it is in a way, therefore, all beings. So it's, again, close to what Plato talks about where, this is the realm of the forms, and so the soul then comes to grasp the form, which is, all things are a derivative of the realm of forms. For Aristotle, the soul, right, the essence of all things is present in themselves, and the soul then, to know it, takes on the form of that thing it knows, which is why then if it does truly know it, it doesn't go wrong. I think an interesting discussion question would be to consider Aristotle's conception of life. So what do you think about Aristotle's conception of life? You could think about this from a scientific point of view. You could think about this maybe from a religious point of view. Do you agree with how he defines life? And a way to think about this to go about answering this question, is a virus a life form according to Aristotle? Would a virus meet the criteria for which Aristotle says, right, all life contains? And I think, I have the Merriam-Webster definition provided here for the definition of a virus. You could learn more through Google if you wanted to know more about a virus before, of course, making your decision. But I'd be interested to know what you think about that.